Well, good morning, everyone. It's always good to be back, and I really do appreciate the Bible study this morning. I think the book of John is my favorite gospel. I don't say I think. The book of John is my favorite gospel, and it was really good this morning to see some of the points that were made, and Steve did a really good job in preparation for that lesson this morning, and it inspired me for the next lesson that I do here. And so, Lord willing, next first Sunday of the month, I'll bring a lesson about John as well. And I'm pulling it out of my archive, if you will, to do that. It was very edifying this morning, and I do appreciate that. But this morning, we're not going to talk about that. This morning, if you recall, about a year ago now, it was the second lesson I presented here. I presented the soldiers of Christ, a warrior's mindset. And in that lesson, I talked about spiritual warfare. I talked about we are at war and you need to be ready. And it's a war, a spiritual war that's going on around us, whether you can see it or not. It's actually happening. And we need to believe that as Christians. Today, I'm going to expound upon that tonight. It's kind of this morning, it's kind of a follow-on to that, if you will. And it's continuing the theme of a warrior's perspective on spiritual warfare and what's going on all around us. This morning's lesson is entitled, Know Your Enemy. I don't know if you can see that. You can see the red eyes. Maybe I shouldn't do dark backgrounds here. Our enemy is Satan. And again, whether or not you can see him, he exists. And this is a lesson I've thought about for a long while. In my military training, one of the things I was taught was MILDEC, military deception. It's the art of influencing the enemy, getting the enemy to think something in particular, to get him to take or not take a particular action. You're deceiving him. And so maybe you make yourself look bigger than you are to intimidate. Maybe you make yourself look smaller than you are to get him to attack a particular place, and then you can overwhelm with force. Maybe you try and convince him to take this route instead of that route. And there are tactics within military deception that, as I was learning about it at the time, and certainly since since that time, I've realized there is a tremendous overlap in the way Satan deceives us. And so this morning's lesson, I'd like to kind of go into some of those tactics and show you from the enemy's perspective how we specifically, but the world in general, human beings, can be deceived. You see, he'd love to get you to think particular things in order to get you to go to hell where he's ultimately destined to go. You see, one of the hardest things to do is to fight an enemy that you cannot see. But you're in a war with him and his forces, the devil and his angels, constantly, whether you can see him or not. But we know he exists, and we know that he is out to get us, especially if we're Christians. 1 Peter 5:8 says, the devil prowls around like a roaring lion, and he's looking for someone to devour. And so we know that he's in existence. We know that he's out looking for us, for some easy prey. And he's trying to devour us. Very strong language. The problem is that the devil and his angels don't look like this on the screen. This mean-looking lion, or on the screen before with the red eyes and the evil look upon his face. And he doesn't act like Satan did with Jesus in the wilderness. And he's there and he says, look, here's some stones, turn them to bread. It's very in your face, and you know him and you see him and you know what he's trying to do. Often it's quite the opposite. It's very subtle. It's difficult to detect. And so we need to study our enemy. We need to know our enemy. We need to understand who he is and how he works. We need to know the tactics that he employs so that we can counter those tactics. The idea is that if I can understand how the enemy thinks and how he works, I can be better prepared to thwart his attacks. Sun Tzu once wrote that if you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. And of course, he's talking about military, earthly battles. But the same is true about Christians, but even more so. We must know our enemy. We must know ourselves, specifically our weaknesses in this case, and we must know our God. We must know our enemy and how he works, but we must know ourselves, especially our weaknesses, because as a military commander, I'm not going to attack my enemy's strengths. I'm going to attack his weaknesses. I'm going to put the full force of my forces against the weakest part of his defense, the chinks in his armor, the cracks in his foundations, so that I can break him in that particular regard, and then I can begin to defeat him. And Satan is no different. He knows our weaknesses. And you can bet that's where he's going to attack. So if you don't know your weaknesses, you better figure it out, because that's your most likely place where you're going to be attacked. And we have to know our God. If we have God on our side and we believe in his power and know, as I said in spiritual warfare, in Soldiers of Christ lesson, if you know the tools that he has given you, the armor of God, you understand the power that has been given to you to counter the enemy's attacks. Now we know, kind of generally speaking, how the devil works, how Satan tempts us. 1 John 2:16, he outlines the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the pride of life. And those are the things that are of this world, that are not of the Father. And we learn in 2 Corinthians 4:14 that Satan is the god of this world. And so the god of this world, Satan, uses those lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, and the pride of life against us. And we see this in Jesus in the wilderness again, those things being used. But what does that mean? That's still pretty generic. And what I want to do this morning is to put you in his shoes, in Satan's shoes, and see his tactics from his point of view, to show you a different perspective. Now, I borrowed this concept, this method, from a book by C.S. Lewis called The Screw Tape Letters. It's a very unique book, and I love it because it gives you a different perspective. It's told through letters. Each chapter is a letter written from one demon to another. It's an uncle and a nephew. So the uncle is writing the letters to his nephew, and he's mentoring him on how to subtly lead his human that he's been assigned away from God and towards Satan and hell through everyday temptations and spiritual pitfalls. And so it's a fascinating book to get an insight into how the enemy thinks and how the enemy works, and it's through subtle means. It's a very insightful book. It's written in the 1920s, I believe, so it's a little difficult sometimes, but it's really cool to see how the enemy works, and you go, okay, I see what you're doing there. Not to me, not today, Satan. And so the real goal in this lesson is not just what I'll be talking about this morning, but it's for you to see the devil's tactics whenever you read your Bible, and to pick out what tactic is actually being used in whatever you're reading at the time. So you can see Satan when he's at work, even when the Bible doesn't specifically call it out, and most times it doesn't. And so let's jump right in. The first tactic that I'll point out is deception. And you're like, yeah, well, no duh, right? Satan is first and foremost a deceiver. But I want to talk about a very specific deception. Deception is a pretty big umbrella. Satan is explicitly referred to as the deceiver of the whole world in Revelation 12 and 9. He's referred to as a liar and the father of lies in John chapter 8. But the specific deception I want to talk about is that it is really easy to deceive you into continuing something you already believe. You're already convinced of it. So it's easy, especially when it's an error, it's easy to keep you to believe in those things. Going back to my military deception training, this actually has a name. It's the Magruder's Principle. It's the idea that it's often much easier to deceive an enemy into hanging on to their pre-existing incorrect beliefs than it is to trick them, deceive them, into changing those beliefs. What does that mean? If my enemy thinks that I have very few weapons, then I'm going to use that to my advantage and show him confirming those things. And then when he wants to pick a fight with me, then I can unleash a whole lot more than what he was expecting. Or maybe he wouldn't put as much forces up against me, and so I can use that to my advantage. It's a whole lot easier to do that and use that to your advantage than it is to convince them of something else. You think about anything very strongly held belief, right? Most of the time it is really hard, especially in religion and politics and some other places areas where people dig in deep, right? It's a whole lot easier to make you bolster a belief you already closely hold than it is to convince you of something completely different. It's a very difficult thing. And so Satan wants to use the Magruder's principle. Human nature is that when I hold a strongly held belief, I'm going to look out and find confirming evidence for that belief. And even if there's some evidence against what I believe, I'm probably going to have a tendency to ignore that. And that's been shown in human nature. This was, again, part of my training. It's called the confirmation bias. You see evidence to confirm what you believe. Well, where do we see this in the Bible? The first example that came to me, we could probably do a whole lesson on just this deception, right? The first example is that the Pharisees. They had plenty of evidence to believe the works, the signs that Jesus did, that proved to him as being from heaven. And even Nicodemus admits it when he goes to Jesus. But Satan used their internal motives to blind them from the truth. And that was actually on the slide here a moment ago. The God of this world has blinded their minds, the minds of the unbelieving, to the gospel. But he does it in other ways as well. And so turn with me to Luke chapter 20. In Luke chapter 20, Jesus calls this out and he specifically states it and very concisely. Luke chapter 20, verses 45 through 47. It says that, and while all the people were listening, he said to the disciples, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and love respectful greetings in the marketplaces, and their chief seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets, who devour widows' houses and for appearance sake offer long prayers. These will receive greater condemnation." Those are their weaknesses. And so what Satan did was he deceived them in such a way through those things that they were unwilling to see or accept that Jesus was who he said he was. But what does that have to do with Magruder's principle? You see, the Jews at the time, by and large, believed that the Messiah would be a political one. They had this picture of what he was going to look like, and he was going to be kind of like a military leader or someone who was going to overthrow the government and then sit on a physical earthly throne. And when Jesus comes, it's completely upside down, and they can't accept that because that was a firmly held, pre-existing, incorrect belief. But it's easier to keep you thinking that than it is to change your beliefs. And so you can see Satan at work in the Pharisees in that regard. Well, how do we see that today? Well, if I'm Satan and I'm trying to persuade an atheist, I'll tell him it's foolish to believe that there's a God. I'd say that all the science points to chance or the Big Bang or evolution. I would say you have enough other things to believe in than an all-knowing and powerful God. That's just a silly concept. And who are you to doubt these highly educated scientists with all these PhDs and whatnot? Do you see how manipulative Satan can be to an already strongly held belief? And everything around you can be confirmation of that belief. What about non-believers? If I'm Satan, I'm going to tell a non-believer, There's no way you can be forgiven. You've done too many bad things in your life to deserve forgiveness. Now, you notice there's a kernel of truth in that. We don't deserve forgiveness. But the full-blown lie is that God can't or won't forgive you. But he doesn't state it that way. I wouldn't state it that way if I were Satan. It's stated like, you're too bad to be forgiven, so don't even try. What about Christians? If I'm Satan, and this is in the Screw Tape Letters, he really does, C.S. Lewis does a masterful job at this. I'm going to tell a Christian that their false doctrines are true. Whatever they are, whatever those false doctrines are, I'll tell them just to believe whatever the preacher or the denomination says from the pulpit and not to question it. And I'm going to tie your beliefs so tightly to your pride and your identity, or the person that you really care about that taught you those things, that even the mere insinuation that you might be wrong is insulting. And I'm going to feed that lie. And I'm going to make you dig in even more on that false belief, on that false doctrine. And so these are just some of the ways our enemy can use deceptive tactics against us. And so this is why it is so important for Christians to be critical thinkers. We can't just believe what just anyone says just because they say it from a pulpit or they've had a lot of training in biblical studies. We have to challenge what we're taught and even what we already believe. Test the spirits. Test what you've been taught. Test what you believe. God can handle it. And it's imperative that we do so because we may believe something in error. And Satan would love to keep you convinced in your error. So when you're going about your daily life, be on the alert and on the lookout for these tactics, and don't believe him when he says these kinds of things. Be a critical thinker. The next thing I'll point out is comfort. Satan uses comfort as a tactic. And so comfort is that idea of returning to things or doing things that you enjoy rather than delaying gratification. We find this out in Hebrews chapter 11. It's on the screen, but it's also, I'm going to read it from my Bible because it's really hard to see it from that far away. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 24 says, "By faith Moses, when he had grown up, he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter." Why? Because he chose rather to endure ill treatment with the people of God than enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. This is a comforting passage for me because it reinforces that sin is pleasurable. And so I shouldn't feel guilty for feeling like it's pleasurable, just like God-given feelings, doing things that God has given us to enjoy is pleasurable. But those sinful things, they're very short-lived, but often they're comfortable. Choosing the passing pleasures of sin over and over rather than denying that instant gratification that was told about Moses. You want to delay that gratification in anticipation for a longer lasting, greater reward. Some of you may have heard of the marshmallow test. So a group of young kids, I'm probably before 10 years old, I don't remember the age, were put in a room and one at a time, right? So this was done on a group, but it's one single kid in a room with a table and a marshmallow. And the deal was you can eat this marshmallow right now. It's free, no penalty. But I'm going to give you 15 minutes. And if you cannot eat that marshmallow, I'm going to give you 2 after that 15 minutes. And these kids, it was so hilarious to watch these kids, the things that they did to not eat that marshmallow. Like some wouldn't make eye contact with it. They'd turn around and they'd not look at it. They would sit there and stare at it and their face would get all red because they wanted the marshmallow. And some of them partook of the marshmallow. Nothing wrong with that. But 15 minutes went by and some of those kids didn't partake of the marshmallow and they got 2. Delayed gratification. Fast forward about 15 years, and the people who ran this study kept up with those kids and they checked back in with them. And by and large, I think it was 70 or 80% of them, the ones that delayed the gratification, had more successful careers in their 20s than the ones who just, I want that marshmallow right now. And so Satan can use this because it was hard for them to delay that gratification. They wanted that one marshmallow right then. So if I'm Satan, I'm going to encourage you to take the comfortable choice rather than the right one. Again, one marshmallow wasn't wrong, but there was a greater reward if they held off. And it was just 15 minutes. I'm sure it felt like decades to them while they're sitting there looking at the marshmallows. We have a biblical example of this. Remember Satan's first temptation to Jesus in the wilderness. Jesus is in the wilderness for 40 days. He's hungry. Satan's first temptation was comfort. These are stones, and you have the power to turn that into bread. Feed yourself. Fill your belly. Aren't you hungry? Well, we know Jesus resisted, delayed gratification. Comfort is what we're talking about. Satan uses comfort. He uses comfort to keep you warming a pew. If I'm Satan, I'm going to make you feel like just showing up on Sunday morning for worship service is enough to be saved, and you don't have to do anything for the rest of the week. No Bible reading, no study, no prayer, no relationship with God. Warming the pew gives you just enough feel good to keep your guilt low and live a comfortable life. And you don't have to do the uncomfortable thing of confronting your sins. Comfort also keeps you from evangelizing because you fear rejection. If I'm Satan, I'm going to remind you over and over and over again how bad it feels when people will not accept the gospel. Nobody likes to be rejected. I'm going to take that feeling and I'm going to crank it up to 10. Never mind that we know that they're not rejecting me, they're rejecting God. What did God say to Samuel in 1 Samuel? When the people are asking for a king, and Samuel's distraught and he's frustrated, and God says, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. Oh, by the way, Jesus was rejected over and over and over again. But if I'm Satan, I'm not going to emphasize those things. I'm going to keep you comfortable. What about with money? Another thing I'll do if I'm Satan is get you to put your trust in money. I'll get you to focus too much on money. Think about it. If you have a lot of money, you have a tendency to be afraid to lose it or even to give it away. And if I'm Satan, I'm going to remind you that your safety comes from money and that you need to hold on to it or you're not going to have your security blanket. I believe Satan was at work, again, reading your Bible and seeing Satan's tactics. Satan was at work when the rich young ruler couldn't give away all of his possessions because he had great wealth. He was comfortable, and his wealth became his God. So when you're about your daily life and you have a desire to do the comfortable thing, stop and consider, is it from the devil? Is this his way of making me stumble? Is there something else better that I should be doing? Many times, not always, but many times, the right thing to do is uncomfortable. We as Christians need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. Abram probably wasn't comfortable with leaving his land and just going. Just go. I'm not going to tell you where. Who knows where you're going to go? Just pick up your family and leave. That was probably uncomfortable. Moses clearly wasn't comfortable after his 40 years in the wilderness, going back to Pharaoh and telling him to let my people go. He argued with God, but ultimately went. That wasn't very comfortable. David was faced with multiple opportunities to kill Saul so that he can take the throne already, but he knew the right thing to do was the uncomfortable thing, which was to wait and let it happen on God's timing. And then Jacob talked about it this morning at the Lord's table. Jesus could have done the comfortable thing and avoided the cross. He asked for the cup to be passed from him, but ultimately he did. Uncomfortable is probably, understatement. It's definitely an understatement. He did the uncomfortable thing. The apostles did the comfortable thing when they denied Jesus. And that was a mistake, obviously. But they learned their lesson. In secular history, extra-biblical accounts tell us they were all but one martyred for their faith. They ultimately did the uncomfortable but right thing. So beware of comfortable things. Many times the devil is lurking behind them with a trap. Now, another way that you can say comfort is a problem that we faced a lot in the military, and that's complacency. Sometimes we can be doing pretty well and we let our guard down. Sometimes we as Christians can be doing really well and want to hit autopilot, right? I'm doing pretty good. And you let your guard down. David did this before he sinned with Bathsheba. Was it wrong? I don't know. But the Bible specifically states that his armies went off to war, and every other time he went with those armies, but it specifically states that he stayed at home. That's comfortable. I mean, he lived in a palace. But we know what happened right after that. He got complacent. He did the comfortable thing. So in the military, a lot of bad things happen because we get complacent. But the same can be true for Christians as well. Don't get complacent, and don't seek the comfortable route. Well, I said next time I'll be talking about John. So the time after next, I didn't realize this one was going to go so quick, but that's probably good news, right? I might talk about distraction and manipulation, two more of the devil's tactics. And they don't all neatly fit into bins, and so sometimes it may be disorganized, but Satan has a lot of tactics, and he's very, very good at what he does. And so I challenge you to know your enemy, to be on the lookout for Satan's tactics. Don't just read the stories in the Old Testament. Study them to see what tactic is being employed or what weakness is being exploited. Sometimes that's just as valuable. Is it pride? Is it greed? Is it lust? Learn how our enemy works so that you can effectively counter his tactics like Jesus did in the wilderness. As I said earlier, we have to know ourselves and know our enemy, but we also have to know our God. When we have God on our side, we can resist the devil and he will flee from us. We have the armor of God to put on when he is on our side, but we have to have him on our side. If you're here today and you haven't responded to the gospel, you do not have God on your side, and you stand no chance.